And I want to, this is the fourth of a 6-week series. I want to ask you to start thinking about your views on whether or not we should continue Saturday night. If I have enough people that are interested, we might change the format. We've talked about the idea of doing more in-depth kind of a Bible study. Maybe not necessarily have the whole band, although I don't know. Maybe the band wants to stay. I don't know. They're, I love them. I think they're great, so it's kind of up to them. But I'm open to that. It's just, we'll see if there's enough interest to do it. Okay, so this is the fourth of a 6-week series, and we've been focusing differently on Saturday night. We've been focusing on specific topics, unlike what I do on a Sunday morning, which is going through the Bible chapter by chapter and verse by verse. And in fact, tonight is going to be somewhat unique. Tonight will be almost pure science instead of what you normally get, which is, going through the Bible. Not that the Bible is bad or anything, but this is necessary. We need to go through this stuff. In fact, quite honestly, the reason that I am a Christian today is the stuff that I'm going to be sharing with you right now. It's part of my personal testimony, and I'm going to go into that a little bit later. But I want to start this evening with a little story. Okay, once upon a time, Sherlock Holmes and Watson, how many of you have heard of Sherlock Holmes? Please don't tell me you're that old. Okay, anyway, Sherlock Holmes and Watson decided they wanted to go camping. And so they went out there and they had their s'mores and they sat around the campfire and they did what camping people do. So they went into the tent, went to bed, go to sleep. And some hours later, Holmes awakens suddenly and he shakes Watson and he says, "Watson, what do you see?" And Watson's, thinking, well, this is Sherlock Holmes. I've got to answer the right way. So he looks up and he says, well, I see millions of stars. And Holmes says, "Well, what does that tell you?" And Watson thinks about it and he says, "Well, astronomically, that tells me that there's millions of galaxies. And orologically, I can deduce from the stars that I see that it's probably about 3 o'clock in the morning. And theologically, I can see that God is all powerful and we are weak and insignificant. And meteorologically, I can see that it's probably going to be a beautiful day. Well, what does it tell you?" And Holmes says, "Watson, you idiot, someone has stolen our tent." How many of you know that some things in life should be obvious? They should be obvious. You went to bed in a tent, you wake up and you see the stars. Something is missing, okay? So, the evidence, when it's right in front of you, should make something like that obvious. But so often, we're blind to what's obvious. Either we blinded ourselves or someone else has been successful in keeping us from seeing what is obvious. Now, if there really is, really, as real as this podium that I can feel, as real as the ground under my feet, if there is as real as that, if there really is an all-powerful, all-knowing creator, it should be obvious. If there really is an all-loving, perfect, just judge, shouldn't that be obvious? Shouldn't it be something that you couldn't miss? And shouldn't the knowledge of this completely change how you see life? If it's really, 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 really real, how in the world could you walk around under the sun that he made and completely ignore him? How could you walk around and breathe his air in the lungs that he built inside of you and pretend that you don't need him? You see, understanding that God is as real as something like this should completely change how you see everything. And in fact, that's part of my testimony, is that when I understood from a scientific point of view that I could really believe this, See, I was a young man and a kid. And you grow up in church, and my dad was struggling with agnosticism and all these things. And so I saw the hypocrisy of people who said they were Christians, but I saw what they lived like during the week. And as a young man, a kid, really, I was only about 12 or 13. I can't remember exactly. I just thought, how do I keep this together in my head between what my mother is telling me and what my pastor at church is telling me and what I'm learning in school? I had just done a science fair project. I got first prize, by the way, just so you know. Anyway, it was 8th grade. So first prize, and I'd done this on the theory of evolution. And my father, who was, struggling with the whole agnosticism thing, that really worried him, but there was nearly nothing he could say about it. Until one day, he found out that there was a man named Dr. Dwayne T. Gish speaking at a little church. There were only 20 or 30 people there that night that Dad and I went to hear Dr. Gish. But Dr. Gish had a PhD in biochemistry. He was a real scientist with real credentials. And he showed me that I can really believe. And I'm going to be giving you a bunch of this information that Dr. Gish once gave me. Later, we became friends. Dr. Gish wrote the foreword to my book, Someone's Making a Monkey Out of You. He recently passed away a few years ago. I'm looking forward to seeing him again someday. Hopefully not that soon, but still someday soon. But Dr. Gish is one of my heroes because he was willing to come to a small church, even with those kinds of credentials, driving for hours just to come and speak to 20 or so people. This is long before the internet. And he made a difference in my life, and I'm hoping that if you are willing to keep an open mind and really follow the evidence where it leads, not where you want it to go, but where it leads, that it will make a difference in your life. But I am going to give you fair warning that this is mostly science. I will try to take the big words and make them half as big. And it is mostly science. So if some people get frustrated with that. I came to church and you give me one verse and a whole bunch of science. Well, I warned you, okay? I'm going to give you 2 verses. The first one is Romans chapter 1, and it says very clearly in verse 18, it says, what can be known about God is obvious. It's right there in the creation. So if you deny it, I'm paraphrasing, if you deny it, then you're a fool. You're a fool. And that's the warning. Does that make sense? That's the warning. If you see this clearly and you still deny it, you are a fool. That's what the Bible is telling me. Now, what we're going to do is we're going to begin with understanding what is science in the first place. The reason we need to do that is because how many of you know that in our world today, they've elevated scientists and science up to this, they're basically the priests of secularism today. I mean, they're at the top. If you've got the credentials, if you've got the PhD, then obviously you know more than everybody else. There's a certain credibility that comes with science. And in fact, there's a lot of pressure on Christians. There's a lot of pressure on average people walking around that, well, what the scientists say, and I see the Bible seems to say something different. We're going to find out tonight the Bible doesn't say anything different from science. Not from real science. So sometimes people feel like there's this disconnect. And we've got to show that there really isn't. So let's begin with the word science. Let's talk about what science really is. This is the definition of science. It is a branch of study which is concerned with a connected body, now here's the key, of demonstrated truths, or with, here's the second important word, observed facts. Now we take those observed facts, we systematically classify them, we more or less colligate them, that means put them into categories, by being brought under general laws. Laws, not ideas, not speculations, laws. And which include trustworthy methods for the discovery of new truth within its own domain. Now, so science primarily is what we can observe, it's what we can put into a laboratory, it's what we can do experiments on. That's really what science is. Now, when you look at the far distant past, you cannot do these two things. This is real science. Science is what is observable and what is repeatable. That's the next slide. What is observable and what is repeatable. If it's not observable and it's not repeatable, it's not science. You can look at things scientifically that are not directly observable and not directly repeatable. We do that all the time. It's called forensic science. But let's think about forensic science for a minute. The reason they put the word forensic on the front of it is because it's about something that happened in the past. We cannot directly observe it. We can't repeat it. The murder has taken place. So what do we have to do since we can't observe or repeat it? We have to look at it scientifically, but forensically. That means we have to look at the evidence and see where the preponderance of the evidence goes. We can never know 100%. But if the evidence is lining up beyond a reasonable doubt, we can convince the jury. But really, it's not real science. Real science is where I take a liquid like water and I put it in a container and I heat it up and I demonstrate the fact that, and I can observe this and I can repeat it in a lab, that if I take this liquid and I heat it to a point of 100 degrees centigrade, it's going to rapidly move from a liquid state into a vapor state. Okay, and that change is going to take place very rapidly, and I'm going to see it because it's going to bubble. We call it boiling. Now, I can observe that, and I can repeat it, and I can put it in 100 different containers, and it'll always come out the same way. So I can systematically classify and come up with a law that if you take water at sea level, and it's pure water, and you heat it to where it's saturated to 100 degrees centigrade, it will boil. That's a scientific law. That's something I can see in and out every day. I can observe it. I can repeat it. That's real science. Whether or not some ape-like creature morphed into what is now a Homo sapien some 3 to 5 million years ago is not something I can observe or repeat in a lab. Therefore, it is not science. Now, we can examine those theories about what might have happened in the past. We can examine it very scientifically. We can take lots of measurements. We can study fossils. We can do all of those types of things, but it's forensic, and that means you're going to have to decide, based on the evidence, which theory about what might have happened in the past is most likely to be correct. But when people tell you, well, science proves that we came from monkeys, this is not so. Someone's making a monkey out of you when they do that. Hence the name of my book. Okay, now, that is what we have to see right from the beginning. It's observable and repeatable. And by the way, I'm going to apologize in advance. This is my soapbox, so if I go long, I'm sorry. Okay, you may leave early if you really like, if I really make you mad, but I get excited about this stuff. Okay, now, the first thing I'm going to say about the theory of evolution is that it is neither observable nor repeatable, and I'm not the only person to think that. Even evolutionists agree with that. For example, Dr. David Kitts, who's an evolutionist, and he wrote in his book, Evolution, Paleontology, and Evolutionary Theory, on page 466, he said, evolution, at least in the sense that Darwin spoke of it, cannot be detected within the lifetime of a single observer. So right there we have a quote that tells us the scientists are saying, we admit it. Evolution is something you can't see. It happens supposedly so slowly that you cannot detect it. Therefore, a scientist cannot observe it. Not directly. And they certainly can't repeat it in a lab. They try, trust me. One of my favorites is they say, oh, well, we've proven that evolution, we can do it in the lab because we do it with fruit flies all the time. We have zapped them with enough radiation. We've got mutants with wings coming out of their eyes and stuff. I mean, we've done all kinds of things. And here's what's interesting about that. They're weird, but they're still fruit flies. Not only are they still fruit flies, but if you leave them alone, and you quit zapping them with radiation, lo and behold, in a few generations, they're back to normal again. Not only that, but scientists, I'm not a scientist per se, but creationist scientists, intelligent design scientists will look at that and go, and who's guiding this experiment? An intelligent agent. This is actually an example of intelligent design when you zap them with enough electricity. Why? Because you're the one that's intentionally hitting specific genes. You're using your intelligence to try to manipulate that DNA. So, do experiments with fruit flies prove evolution? The answer is absolutely not. Same with E. coli. They do, well, we can do millions and millions and millions of generations in our petri dish and show evolution because they are now resistant to certain forms of antibiotics. Except that they're still E. coli, number one, and number two, the capacity for them to resist that drug was already built into their DNA. There's no positive change there. There's no adding of any new information into the DNA. The bottom line is evolution, according to Dr. David Kitts, cannot be observed in the lifetime of a single observer. Therefore, it's not science. It can be a speculation that we look at scientifically, but it's not science. Not by the definition of what is science. Now, of course, there are plenty of people that are going to argue about what is the definition of science, too. In fact, we have people that have majors, they have PhDs in the philosophy of science, and even they can't agree on what is really science. That's true. They're still arguing about it. If you can get a PhD in what is science and still can't answer the question, then I'm here to tell you that evolution is not science. Okay, it's a speculation about what might have happened in the past. So let's get that taken care of. Now, the second thing is we need to understand that you can't see God creating anything new either. You can't see God creating anything new either. So what we have to do is we have to make a decision forensically on how does the evidence line up. The murder has taken place. Now we have to look at the forensic evidence to decide who's guilty. That's what we have to decide. So we're going to be comparing these two ideas. Are you with me? So let's talk about the first one. The first one is the theory of evolution itself. Now, evolution, that's the next slide. Evolution, there you go. Now, evolution is the concept that everything arose gradually over many millions of years. It did this naturally, and what drove it forward was accidental changes that passed through the genetic code of living things. So you have a genetic code that is the plan for the life form as it reproduces. There's an error in the genetic code, and supposedly that confers an advantage on the next generation. That generation survived better, was able to pass on this new information in the genetic code. Now, the problem right out of the gate is that no one has ever observed a positive genetic mistake. Hasn't been observed yet. The only two examples that I have ever heard that scientists have ever bring up, one of them is sickle cell anemia, as if that's supposedly a good genetic mutation, because it keeps people who have sickle cell anemia from getting malaria. Of course, they die before they're 18, so how in the world is that a positive mutation? It's not. Does that make sense? So we've never seen a positive mutation, but scientists say if you wait long enough, one of them is bound to occur. That's the speculation. So over many millions of years, you had a pool of slime somewhere between 1.8 and 3 billion years ago, and supposedly there was an completely accidental clash of non-living chemistry that accidentally clashed together in some form and created deoxyribonucleic acid, DNA, the single most complicated macromolecule ever seen by science. And that supposedly happened by accident. So you went from non-life to life completely by accident. Now, if such a thing really did take place over many millions of years ago, we should be able to repeat this in a laboratory. But as of yet, we have not been able to repeat this incredible series of events. We have not. Now, some people like to bring up the Miller-Urey experiment and things like that. And I didn't put that in my notes, but it's in my head. Suffice it to say, it did not create life in the lab. We can get there. We can talk about that later. I got to move on. But the bottom line is that over millions of years, these mistakes in DNA supposedly changed life forms from basic single-celled organisms all the way up until the multi-celled organisms that we see in the world today. Now, that means that we should see the following things. I should see no purposeful guidance in this process. There should be nothing driving it because it's completely at random. Does that make sense? There's no guidance. There's no intelligence behind it. It's just natural. It's an accident, and this one just happened to have survived better. Now, we should see, if this is true, literally trillions of in-between forms from one life form into another. So if you see Clyde the clam, and he supposedly becomes Fred the fish, you should see a whole lot of things in between. Does that make sense? Those things are called transitional forms between the major kinds. This is what we should see if evolution is true. Remember, we're looking at forensic evidence, right? So I should be able to look at the evidence. Okay, the fossils should show these beautiful transitional series that run from soft-bodied creatures that don't have a backbone all the way up into fish that have a backbone. Okay, we should see these beautiful transitions. And over millions of years, we should see that. And we should be able to show that it could happen by random chance. Now, the opposite side of that, the intelligent design side of that, says something completely different. It says that everything in the universe, all living things, came into existence by the purpose and the planning and the power of a super intelligence. It was an intelligence with the power to literally create out of nothing. Okay, out of nothing. And when you look at the intelligent design concept, what we should see, if there is an intelligent designer, if there really, really is a God who thought this whole thing up, this is what we should see. We should have, can I go to the next slide, please? I'm missing my slide person. Where did Doug go? He was going to do slides for me. Okay, we should see living systems that are designed with complex parts that cannot be explained by any natural step-by-step process. That should be the norm, because that's what intelligent designers do. Intelligent designers, like humans, build computers. They don't expect computers to naturally evolve from stuff in a junkyard. No, they purposely, intelligently go in there and put it together. And there's no step-by-step way. You have to have an intelligence that plans it out and puts it together. That's normal in our environment as human beings. If there's really an intelligent designer, that's what we should see in nature. The second thing is we should see no macro changes in living systems. In other words, Clyde the clam is not going to become Fred the fish. There will be lots of different kinds of clams and lots of different kinds of fish, but there will be no transitions between the two. What we should see instead is we should see variation within a kind, but there should be barriers between the major kinds. That's what we should see if there really is an intelligent designer. So what we're going to do now is we're going to jump in to that evidence. Now, I'm going to start with a quote from Dr. Henry Morris, who had a PhD in hydrologic engineering, and Dr. John Morris, who has a PhD in geology. And they say the following: if evolution is true, then the evidence for that development ought to be found in the fossil record of the past, if it's going to be found anywhere. There must have been many preliminary forms. There must have been many transitional forms, and there should be at least a statistical sampling of these preserved in the fossils. Does that make sense? If evolution really happened, if it really came about, we should be able to look back into the fossils, and at least statistically speaking, we should be able to find these transitions moving from one form into another. Now, let's go take a look at the fossil record and take a look at fossils themselves. Now, what is a fossil? First of all, a fossil is the hard remains of a plant or an animal that has died, and when they have died, they're preserved primarily by mineralization. That is where the material of the animal is replaced by surrounding minerals. It's literally turned into stone over time. That's what we should see when we look at fossils. Now, fossils, now this is not in my notes, but fossils, according to evolution, should be relatively rare. Here's why. Because when an animal dies, it decays. We all know this. We've had enough, animals die around us to see it. I remember I had a raccoon get hit by a car in front of my house when I first started teaching on evolution creation. Went out and took pictures of it. It only took about 4 days for that animal to decay into basically nothing, just scattered bones. Just within a few days, it was gone. Because you're going to have the scavengers within your own body, your own bacteria are going to begin to eat you. if you die, and all this. Now, the only way for this to be preserved is if it's covered over quickly so that that oxygen is absent from that environment. Does that make sense? It has to be covered over quickly, and it has to be covered over under pressure in order for a fossil to form. So originally, back when I was starting school, they said that because of this, fossils should be rare, relatively rare events. The problem is they're not rare. In fact, there's so many of them, we literally have fossil boneyards with 200 billion skeletons in one area. Okay, there is evidence of huge numbers of fossilized creatures that were fossilized so quickly that in some cases, the animals were still eating each other and they have been fossilized. Some places where animals are giving birth and have been fossilized. There are places where you can find animals with the original pigments of their skin are still impressed into the stone. So that's what we discover, which just so happens to fit a certain story about a guy named Noah, but that's another story. We'll get into that. So evolution, according to the theory, says that once upon a time there was a single-celled organism like this one. And this was an algae, and supposedly over many millions of years, by genetic mistake, this transformed itself into this. Not that one. Next. That one. That's a jellyfish. So what you did is you moved over many millions of years from an algae, which is a single-celled organism, into a multi-celled organism, and it supposedly took somewhere between 1.5 and 3 billion years. Now, I want you to notice those fossils. I had a fossil up here of a jellyfish. I also have a fossil up there of an algae. Both of them are soft-bodied creatures. So when somebody tries to argue with you that we don't have enough transitional forms because they were soft-bodied creatures that didn't fossilize very well, that is not true. We have hundreds of millions of examples of soft-bodied creatures. So what we should see is we should see a transition between algae or an algae-like animal and jellyfish, sea lilies, worms, things like that. Now, we find many thousands, hundreds of thousands of fossils of algae and of soft-bodied animals such as jellyfish and so on and so forth, but we find absolutely nothing in between. Zero transitional forms. Dr. Gish sums it up this way. He says, "Nowhere on this earth, neither on any continent nor at the bottom of any ocean, have we been able to find the intermediates between single-celled organisms and the complex invertebrates. Never been found. We have hundreds of millions. After 200 years of systematic fossil collecting, we still do not have a single one of these supposed transitional forms between these major life forms." Now, the truth of the matter is I have a whole section here that I'm not going to do tonight, which goes through the transition between every single one of the major life forms that we have out there. And you will find that there are no transitional forms anywhere. There are simply none. Just off the top of my head, if you're going to go from a soft-bodied animal that does not have a backbone into something like a fish, which does have a backbone, that is a major transition, don't you think? I mean, a major transition. And in order to have a transition like this, you should see a whole lot of weird in-between forms between these soft-bodied creatures. Now, some people have speculated that it wasn't a true soft-bodied creature. It was something like a clam, because a clam has an exterior shell, and so they somehow speculate that the shell became a skeleton. Okay, so a clam was born inside out, and somehow that made it survive better and it became a fish. Okay, show me the evidence. Oh, you've got lots and lots and millions of clam fossils and millions of fish fossils. You do not have some, I wouldn't even know what to call it, a clamfish, or there's nothing in the middle. Now, you will find this between every major one of the what they call the clades. These are the taxonomic groups. You will not find any of these transitional forms. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. If Clyde the clam decides to be, or Wally the worm decides to become Fred the fish, how do you decide this? I mean, think about that for a second. I have 5 children, and my wife and I did not sit down one day and say, you know what, I want to have children, but I want them with wings, because I think they would survive so much better. Let's concentrate real hard, honey. Does it work this way? Somebody say, no. You've had your 10th grade biology class. You know that you have nothing to say about this. So Wally the worm could not decide to become Fred the fish. We're talking about if this happened by some natural accident, it should have been just a mistake in genetic forms. If you really want to get more on this, I recommend a book called Signature in the Cell by Dr. Fred Meyer, and it will give you a much more detailed example of this. But what I want to do now is I want to quote Dr. Gish again. It says this. He says, incredible. He goes through all of this. He goes through all of these different forms, the transition between mammals or between reptiles and mammals and between amphibians and reptiles and so on. And he goes, incredible. Not only should the fossil record produce billions times billions of fossils of creatures intermediate between the invertebrates and the vertebrates, but it should also produce a vast number of the fossils that reveal the intermediates between the major classes of fish as they deserve. But not one such intermediate has ever been found. Ever. You have billions of pieces of evidence, and you don't have a single true transitional form. Now, I know somebody's going to challenge me on the internet. You're going to bring up Fuchsium something. I forget it now. I got it written down. It's a long word. Okay, it's not a transitional form. Read my blog. Okay, now, somebody will bring up Archaeopteryx. They'll say, well, Archaeopteryx, I mean, we see that in our 7th grade textbooks. Remember Archaeopteryx? How many of you remember that? It's got claws on its wings. It's got teeth in its bill. It's got a long reptilian-like tail. Clearly, this is a transitional form. We have a grand total of 6 of these fossils, by the way. One of them's only a feather, so 5. All right, so now, of these fossils that we look at, what do we really discover? We discover that Archaeopteryx had a furcula, a very robust furcula, which is a breastbone, and a breastbone is something that only birds have. Not only that, we find that there are plenty of other extinct varieties of true birds that have teeth in their bills. Big deal. There's no living birds today that have teeth in their bills, but how many of you know that animals go extinct every year? Okay, so just because there were in the past means exactly nothing. And finally, we have found true bird fossils that are in older strata than Archaeopteryx anyway, so it's a non-starter. You know, so we can go into some of the other transitional forms if it really floats your boat. But the truth of the matter is there are no transitional forms between any of the phyla, none between fish and amphibians, none between amphibians and the reptiles, and absolutely nothing. Here's one of my favorites that shows, now supposedly, mammals came from reptiles. Yes? You've heard this? Okay, reptiles have 6 bones in their jaws, but mammals have 3. So where do the other 3 go? So, according to evolution, in your ear, because you have little tiny bones in your ear. Now, wouldn't that be a major transition to take some bones out of your jaw and shove it in your ear and make them 100 times smaller than they were? Should you not see some major transitional forms in the fossil record showing this transition? There's exactly 0. Nada. Doesn't exist. I'm looking at evidence now. You know, now here's another one that kind of gets me. Every single one of the creatures that I had to study when I was taking anthropology in college, every single one except one has now been thrown out of the supposed human evolutionary tree. I mean, everything that I memorized back in 1986 and 87 when I was going to college that I had to memorize the cranial capacities of Ramapithecus. Okay, I had to memorize all this nonsense for the test, only to find out later that Ramapithecus is no longer considered one of our ancestors. Neither is Gigantopithecus, neither is Zinjanthropus boci. They've all been thrown out. I had to memorize them. Okay, we are left with this. This is supposedly what is the transition between, millions of years ago, our first ape-like ancestor was the Australopithecines, which supposedly evolved into Homo erectus, which supposedly evolved into Homo sapiens. So let's discuss this just for a few minutes. Again, I'm trying to shove several hours worth of stuff into a few minutes. Okay, let's talk about Australopithecus, because I know that many of you have heard of this. But what's interesting about this, before I continue, some evolutionists will tell you that we have a very small amount to work from, right? We don't have a whole lot. In fact, the truth of the matter is, you could take, now listen carefully to what I'm about to say, because it might get challenged, but it is the truth. You could take the evidence, the actual skeletal evidence that shows this series between Australopithecus and Homo erectus. That series right there, you could fit it all on your kitchen table. Most of it is teeth. Most of it is teeth. And they say, well, this tooth is a little more ape-like than this tooth. This one must have been a transitional form. How many of you know there's some variation within teeth? It doesn't prove anything. It's not a lot of evidence. But what's going around right now is that we started with these creatures, Australopithecines. Now, this is Lucy. This is a picture of her bones. Now, how many of you have heard of Lucy somewhere down the line? Okay, most people have. Dr. Johansen discovered her in 1973. I think it was 73, in Ethiopia. Now, what's interesting about her, Ethiopia, Dr. Johansen found this creature and said, this is your ancestor. Now, this is a 40% complete skeleton, and basically what he said is that from the neck up, this creature was very much like a chimpanzee, and everything from the neck down, well, that's basically everything from the neck up was basically human, or is the other way around? Any way you look at it, this is supposed to be your ancestor. But here's what's interesting about this creature. The Australopithecines have been studied a lot since 1973. We found a fair number of others that are supposedly Australopithecines, but it's not a slam dunk. The first reason is the fingers are long and curved like any other apes would be, designed for hanging from trees, unlike yours, which are straight. Okay, the pelvis was in fragments. See the pelvis right there? When it was discovered, it was in little pieces. And you can watch this on National Geographic. They out and out own up to the fact that when they first put the pelvis together, it looked just like a chimpanzee. Well, that doesn't work. That doesn't fit our theory. So what they did is they decided that obviously over millions of years, that pelvis, the bones had been fused together the wrong way because they'd been in the ground for so long. So what they did is they made plaster casts out of this pelvis, and they literally sat down and they smoothed them out and carved them and cut them to make them go the way they're supposed to be. So the experts decided that this animal walked upright in a human manner because they put together the pelvis the way they wanted to, not the way it actually is. And that is a fact. Lord Solly Zuckerman studied these creatures for 20 years using computer analysis and everything else and did not reconstitute the pelvis the way they wanted to, but the way it actually is, and said these animals were chimpanzees, rather large ones, but that's it. The knee joints, there's a lot of controversy on the knees. Dr. Johansen, who's over here at Arizona State, does not like talking about those knees very much. And I'll tell you why. There's only one knee joint. You see it there? Now, the reason is because he once said in a lecture that he discovered the knee joints about 2 kilometers away. Now, he has since withdrawn that comment, so there's a lot of controversy. Where did the knee joints come from, Doc? He's not saying a whole lot, but he actually did say that. And so it has been published in a number of books that the knee joints were found several kilometers away in strata that was 200 feet deeper. So does it prove anything? No, it proves exactly nothing. Now, but what's even more important is that we have found in Ethiopia KNMER 1470, KNMER 1481, and 1590. These are fossils. Those are numbers. What that is Kenya National Museum, KNME, and then ER, which is Ethiopia Rift Valley. That's where it was found. Okay, the same place. These 3 fossils are 100% human. And they're in fossil strata that's actually deeper than Lucy. So what does Lucy show us? A really old chimpanzee. That's it. It does not show us anything. Then you take a look at Homo erectus. Homo erectus supposedly was the next step in your series. But there's a problem with Homo erectus. It depends on who you ask. Some evolutionists will claim that a hominid that they find, well, this must be Homo erectus when it's clearly a gibbon or an ape, but they've decided it must be. And there's others over here that are so obviously human, they should be classified as Homo sapien, but they say they're Homo erectus because we find them in really deep strata, so they must be. In other words, there's a really important thing about evolution that you need to understand. It's what's called index fossiling. Now, what happens in index fossiling is how do I know how old something is? Well, I look at the layers, and I go, well, it's in this layer. But there is no place on Earth where you will find the entire geologic column in order. No place on Earth. In fact, there's no place on Earth where you'll find any of the geologic column over about 5 or 6 strata in any one place. So you have to guess. So what do? You look at the fossils that are in that strata. So in other words, since I know evolution is true, then I'm going to judge my fossils based on the theory of evolution. So how do I know that fossil is really in that series? Well, because evolution says so. This is called a circular argument, a tautology in logic. Okay, it's begging the question. So you're not going to find a whole lot. Now, one of my personal favorites, people ask me about this all the time, is this guy, Neanderthal man. How many of you have heard of him? Everybody's heard of Neanderthal. We think about cavemen, and we think about this guy. Now, Neanderthal man, discovered in the Neander Valley back in the 1800s. At first, this was supposedly the ultimate example of a transitional form. He had real heavy brow ridges. He had a sloping forehead, had almost no chin. His occipital bun in the back was pushed farther back, which means that the spinal column came in at a different place than it does in your body. You have a high vault on your forehead. I mean, they looked at this. They had bowed legs. They were obviously very heavily built, real strong. And you looked at these guys and you went, man, they must have been very, very primitive. But we've been studying them for over 100 years now, and here's what we've discovered. For a long time, they were considered an evolutionary transitional form. Then they became what's called Homo sapien neanderthalensis. They were considered part of the Homo sapien family. Now most scientists go, they were just ugly humans, and there's nothing we can do about it. And they really were, because here's what we've discovered. Their average cranial capacity was 2,200 centimeters cubed. Centimeters squared, cubic centimeters. Yours is about 1,800. They actually had bigger brains than you. Okay, and were they smarter than you? They don't know it, never met one. But here's what I do know. They had everything about them that is human. Music, buried their dead, religion. They had everything about them that was human in terms of crops, community, weapons, jewelry, tattoos. I mean, if you give this guy a haircut and a shave and put him in a suit, you wouldn't even notice. You really wouldn't. You'd have to put a hat on his head because he would be an ugly guy. But other than that, I mean, you've seen ugly people and you go, wow. Okay, well, this is what you would see. I mean, Neanderthal is a human being. And what's interesting about it is they say, well, these guys existed for X number of years and they lived in caves for the most part, and therefore they were primitive. No, living in caves is not a sign of being primitive. Living in caves that's where I got to live because times are tough. And how many of you know right after the flood, times were tough? After Babel, when the languages were confused, there was a lot of warfare and battle, and people were separated. And some of them moved north, which is primarily where you find Neanderthal. You find them from Israel up into Spain. That whole area is primarily where you find Neanderthal specimens. And here's what we've discovered about them. They were an isolated gene pool. And when you have an isolated gene pool, certain parts of you are going to stand out over time. Isn't that right? That is why we have what are called racial characteristics today, but I say that loosely because human beings, we all can inbreed with each other beautifully. We do it long enough, everybody will be a brown. That's kind of where we should go. Okay, is everybody the same color and no problem. But what happens is that you get isolated gene pools and certain things are going to rise to the top. Certain aspects are going to rise to the top. Which is why when you look at Neanderthal skeletal remains, they basically disappear supposedly 200,000 years ago. That's because they got absorbed back into everybody else's. When people began to interact and the ice sheets melted back, there was a re-interaction. In fact, we've done DNA studies on DNA remains, on Neanderthal remains and compared them to modern Europeans, and lo and behold, modern Europeans have Neanderthal DNA in their DNA. Isn't that weird? No, it's not weird at all. They were human beings, and they happened to live in Europe a long time ago, and Europeans still live there. Now, if you want to know more about these bones, if you want to know more about this, I recommend this book. This book is called Bones of Contention. He goes through all 6,000 hominid remains. If you want to go through them, he will go through them for you. And he will show you that humans are humans and apes are apes, period. There is no transitional form. He will show you all of these different Homo erectus remains and why they're human and so on and so forth. I recommend that very strongly. So here's what Dr. Morris says. He says this is amazing. If evolution is true, statistically there should be many transitional forms. In fact, if evolution is really true, it would seem logical that all creatures, living and extinct, should be transitional forms in the process of evolving into new, higher forms right now. And as yet, there are none. It doesn't happen. We don't see evolution happening today. It just doesn't exist. All right, so we're going to go into the next thing, and I know I'm going long, and I apologize. How many of you are okay with that? Okay, good. I'll keep going. All right, Isaiah 1:18 says this. It says, "Come now and let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins are like scarlet, they shall be as white as snow, and though they are red like crimson, I shall make them like wool." Wisdom. The word wisdom and reason here in Isaiah is Yaha. It's actually Yaha. I'm going to get that pronounced right. And it means to be proved right. And what God is saying is He's throwing out a challenge. He's saying, come on, let me show you. I will prove myself right to you. Reason with me and let me show you. God is willing to prove His case that only He could have done this. So what I'm going to talk about now is I'm going to talk about something called irreducible complexity. We said that if we looked at the forensic evidence, and there really was an intelligent designer, we should see things that have no way to, you can't explain them by any step-by-step method. That's what irreducible complexity is. It can't be explained by any natural step-by-step method. If all the parts weren't there, it wouldn't work. So let's take a look at a mousetrap. Now, this guy, Dr. Michael Behe, in his book, Darwin's Black Box, he goes through and he uses a mousetrap to illustrate what we're talking about when we talk about irreducible complexity. Humble mousetrap. Now, this mousetrap right here has the killing machine right there. It has the holder right here. It has the spring. It has a foundation. And it has the bar that holds this whole thing together. Now, do you have, at this point, a functioning mousetrap? Somebody say no. Because unless you're going to throw this at the mice, you're not catching any mice. What do you have to do? You have to charge it. So I have to pull this back very carefully in front of all these people so I don't kill myself. And then I have to very carefully say, and we all know this because how many of us have snapped ourselves trying to do this? Okay. All right. But it takes an intelligent agent just to charge this thing. Now, this is an example of what we call irreducible complexity. If you remove any part of this device, you don't catch half as many mice. You don't catch any mice. You remove any one of the parts. And all of the parts need to be in the right place at the right time, the right spatially placed in order to function, and you need an intelligent agent not only to charge it, but to bait it. Now, something as simple as this. Now, let's take a look at this for a second. How did this come into existence? Now, we can look at it one of two ways. We can say, well, many millions of years ago, this was floating in a stream. It was just, randomly floating along. And it just happened to bang into this. Now, it banged together and, but do we have a mousetrap then? Because if you get it the wrong way, it's not doing you any good. And even if I got it in there, okay, now, do I have a mousetrap yet? No. Are you seeing where this is going? All of the parts have to be in place. And it takes an intelligent agent to put it together. That's what irreducible complexity is. Now, if there really was an intelligent designer, we should see this kind of a thing. Now, if you look at a living cell, living cells are literally light years ahead of the complexity of a mousetrap. I mean, light years ahead of the complexity. We are looking at things that have molecular machines within molecular machines. They have cargo routes. They have on and off switches, pulleys, cables, electrical machinery, manufacturing plants that are 100,000 times smaller than any machine ever built by human beings. They all function perfectly together, almost as if somebody put it together. Isn't that interesting? Now, cells move, cells reproduce, cells process food and energy. They can even charge their own batteries. Cells have parts that are exactly shaped to fit in only one other area of another part in order to transport one part to another part in order to make this part. They have literally parts within parts within parts. And if you are missing even one piece of all of those parts, it doesn't function at all. This is irreducible complexity. It's right in your cells. That's what we're talking about. Now, there is simply no way that you can start with something that's less complex and build something like this cell. I mean, again, let's go back to our example of the mousetrap. Just imagine that this is, the wood bounces into all of these pieces. Do you kill mice? No, because it hasn't been charged yet. And it hasn't been baited yet. This has a purpose. It's not random. Because even when you put all the parts together and bait it, the purpose is mousicide. That's the purpose. You see, and when you look at living systems, they have a purpose. They have a purpose, and it's important for us to understand. Let me give you some examples. The butterfly right here. Now, what's interesting about butterflies, this is an example of an irreducibly complex system. We've all been to third grade. We have all, second or third grade, where you have the teacher and the caterpillars and the fresh leaves, and we all watch this happen. We've seen this, we understand it. But what you don't understand is that the scientists haven't got a clue how this works. Not a clue. Because what happens is that when the caterpillar gets into that cocoon, it literally melts itself. If you open up the cocoon, you will find nothing but jelly inside. There is nothing, no heartbeat, no nothing. It completely melts itself into jelly and somehow reconstitutes itself into a completely different animal. Now, what's amazing about this is evolutionists have looked at this and they thought, well, over millions and millions of years, caterpillars became butterflies. Just by random accidental chance. But there's a problem with that. Caterpillars have no reproductive organs. Okay? They have no reproductive organs at all. So how in the world did they reproduce over millions of years to become butterflies if they can't reproduce? Not only that, caterpillars have mouth parts that are designed only to eat leaves. Their internal system is designed to digest leaves. They are designed to crawl, but butterflies, they don't have mouth parts that can eat leaves. They have a long straw from which they suck nectar. Their internal structure, their structure for stomach and all of that, gastrointestinal structure is designed for nectar, not for leaves. And the funny part about it is that butterflies do have reproductive organs. But they just keep giving birth to more caterpillars for some reason. This is called an irreducibly complex system. And there's no way to explain it. Millions and millions and millions of years ago, supposedly, it must have been a butterfly because they're the only ones that have reproductive organs. I mean, laid eggs and out came a caterpillar? How in the world did that happen? And how did the caterpillar figure out by random mistake, hey, you know what? If I melt myself, I can become a flying creature. Do you see how ridiculous this is? But supposedly scientists say that this simple, it's not simple, but we look at this structure and we, look at what Dr. Gish says. He sums it up this way. He says, there's no evidence how such a remarkable plan of life ever came about. Indeed, the change is truly miraculous and could never be explained as a product of evolution. It's impossible. There's no way to explain it. And when you find amber fossils that have perfect, caterpillars with no reproductive organs, just like they are today, nothing's changed. This system's been around since it's been around. But there's more to it than that. How many of you understand at least a little bit about DNA? Deoxyribonucleic acid. We all know this because that's what you leave at the crime scene, right? You know that. You've seen enough CSI, enough NCIS. You know that that's what you leave. You leave a hair, and somebody's going to find out you were there, and you're guilty. All right. So unless you're dressed, completely in plastic from head to foot, don't kill people. Okay, because you're going to leave evidence, DNA, and it's unique to you. Is that not right? We all know this. Now, DNA is a fascinating macromolecule. Now, it is the basis of all of life. It's made out of phosphates, sugars, and around 20 amino acids. Now, the problem with that, now listen, in order to synthesize DNA, you have to have protein catalysts. But it's DNA that manufactures or designs and leads to the design of protein in the first place. Chicken or the egg. So let me say it again. In order to synthesize DNA, you have to have a protein-built factory called the ribosome. Okay, in order to have that, you have to have protein in order to make DNA, but you need DNA to make the protein. You can't have both. But it gets worse than that. The amino acids that are inside this DNA that make up protein are all left-handed, not right-handed. Now this is important because amino acids in nature exist in left-handed and right-handed varieties in a 50-50 fashion. 50-50. If you have even one right-handed amino acid in your DNA chain, the whole thing will not work. Even one. Now think about that. Remember I told you about the Miller-Urey experiment? They tried to show how life could exist, and they created what's called a reducing atmosphere in the lab, and they synthesized it, and they zapped it with lightning, and said, oh, look, we found the building blocks of life. Look, if you find a couple of bricks does not mean you have a building. Right? They found a few bricks. But guess what they found? They were not optically pure. Optically pure means all left-handed. They were left and right-handed 50-50, just like we find them all in nature. But you have to have only left-handed amino acids. What are the odds? What are the chances that you could take 50-50, left-handed and right-handed, mix them all together, and come up with a DNA chain that's literally billions long, and they're all left-handed? Somebody tried to figure that out. His name was Sir Fred Hoyle, and this is what he concluded at the end. He said there's about 2,000 enzymes, about 2,000 proteins, and the chance of obtaining them all in a random trial is only 1 part in 10 to the 40,000th power. Now let me explain to you how big that number is. That's a 1 with 40,000 zeros about 1 chance in 10 to the 40,000th power. To try to put that in perspective, if you looked at 30 billion years, there are only 10 to the 18th seconds in 30 billion years. If you had 100 billion planet Earths, and you had one random trial every second for 30 billion years, you would not have enough time to randomly assemble even one. And there are billions. Let me say it again. The art, real science, the chances that by just random mixture, you could come up with what we have in our DNA and our skin cells right now is one chance in 10 to 40,000 pounds. You could not reach those odds if we had 100 billion planet Earths, and on every single planet Earth you had a perfect soup with all of the chemistry you absolutely wanted. And all of you could zap it one chance, one trial every second for 30 billion years, and you wouldn't even come close to that number. And that's just to get one randomly assembled DNA. Is that irreducibly complex or what? It gets better. Oh, it gets better. It gets better. Because, you see, the statistics, the odds that you could take the random chemistry and create DNA, you have better odds than if you ran, listen, if you ran a hurricane through a junkyard, you could get this. If you could run a hurricane through a junkyard and get a fully functional 747, you have better odds of doing that than getting one DNA by random chance. I know time is, I'm just getting excited, I'm sorry. I got a few more things. And a few more. 5 more minutes. I'll go fast. Okay, that DNA, let's talk about that DNA. It's a code. Now, what kind of a code is it? What's exciting about this code is they have now discovered that DNA can be read one direction for one kind of protein, and the very same can be read the other direction for a whole different protein. In other words, it has codes within codes. And what's worse than that for evolutionists to try to explain is that we have now discovered something called epigenetic information. This is the sugar code on the exterior of cells that's even more complicated than DNA, and DNA will interface with it in order to design the cell itself. Now, how in the world can you come up with this by random chance? Well, Sir Fred Hoyle says this: the notion that the operating program of a living cell could be arrived at by chance in a primordial soup here on Earth is evidently nonsense of a high order. This is one of the most important and celebrated astronomers in the history of science said this. Now, this code within a code. And we looked at codes, we talked about DNA, but there's a kicker on this. We said, okay, we got all these codes, and this is really cool, and the odds of this coming together, and some people say, well, yeah, the odds are pretty bad, but you know, crazy things happen all the time, and I'm going to believe in chance. Okay, fine, if you want to bow down to the God of chance, you can do that, but there's a problem with that. Even if you had all the chemistry, even if you were able to synthesize some form of DNA, it would be destroyed by ultraviolet light. But in order to get rid of your ultraviolet light, you need something called ozone. We've all heard of the ozone hole, right? Well, ozone's made out of, say it with me, come on, oxygen. Come on, guys, you were 10th grade biology. I wasn't 10th grade biology. Please tell me you got good stuff. Okay, anyway, oxygen that's messed up, O3, becomes ozone, which protects us from ultraviolet light. Well, that ultraviolet light, if you have the ozone, that means you have oxygen, but oxygen breaks down DNA even faster than ultraviolet light. So any way you look at it, even if you were able to synthesize this, it would either be destroyed by ultraviolet light, but if you protect from ultraviolet light with ozone, that means you have oxygen, which would destroy it anyway. In other words, it would be like trying to roll dice. Here's what it is. Try to roll dice, regular dice, and roll them. Now these dice happen to be made out of chocolate. Try to roll these dice and come up with 777 sevens in a row. That's the odds you would need, right? So we're going to roll the dice, and we're going to come up with 777 sevens in a row. That's the odds. But the problem is our dice are made out of chocolate. So every time you fill them, they're melting. Can it happen? Let me say no. That's the odds that DNA could have synthesized by any natural means. So when you look at that, you go, okay, I can't explain the basis of all life because it's irreducibly complex. It's impossible to show. So that means that the facts are, it proves that regular chemistry could not ever have built the specific information you find in DNA, and that's scientifically shown. It's impossible. It's the ultimate mousetrap. And when we look at that, and we look at epigenetic information, we look at all that, there is only one source in the entire universe that can create purposeful information: an intelligent mind. And so far, the only intelligent minds that we have found that can create codes within codes are called human beings. But we didn't create ourselves. That's ontologically impossible. We didn't create ourselves. There must be a designer beyond us. That's what real science says. Dr. Stephen Meyer, PhD from Cambridge, says this: "We know of no presently acting materialistic cause that also generates large amounts of specified information, especially in a digital or alphabetic form." That's what you find in DNA. "Only intelligent design meets the causal adequacy requirements of historical scientific explanation." In other words, our uniform experience of cause and effect shows that intelligent design is the only known cause of the origin of large amounts of functionally specified digital information. That's what you find in DNA. The ability to detect design makes belief in an intelligent designer or a creator or God not only a tenet of faith, but something to which the evidence of nature now bears witness. In short, it brings science and faith into real harmony. That's real science. I mean, we can talk tonight. I've gone an hour and 6 minutes, and I'm sorry. But we can talk tonight about how a woodpecker's tongue is actually longer than its own body. Figure that one out. Okay? How did that happen? By random chance. We could talk tonight about how bat wings somehow came about by their fingers getting longer over millions of years, but we have no evidence of it. What about their sonar? So perfect that as they fly through pitch darkness, they can never hit one another. Hear their own voices with their ears. We could talk about how whales are born tail first, whereas all other mammals are born head first. That is because when whales are born, it would be bad to be born head first because you'd drown. Have they figured that one out over millions of years? We could talk tonight about how photosynthesis in plants is an irreducibly complex system. We could talk tonight about how the flagellum of a bacteria has a motor that is 1/1,000,000th of an inch in diameter, and it is the most perfect cylindrical motor ever devised. How did that come about? By random chance? It couldn't. Bottom line is Isaiah chapter 40, verse 25. And I'll close with this. "To whom will you compare me? Who is my equal?" says the Holy One. "Lift your eyes and look to the heavens. Who created all of these? Do you not know, and have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He will not grow tired or weary, and his understanding no one can fathom." That good stuff right there, or what? Now here's what you can do with this. Now I know we went long tonight, but I warned you in advance, did I not? Please say yes. So my apology was given in advance, and you had the opportunity to listen. Here's what you can do to apply this. You could do some follow-up study of your own. I recommend the following books. Darwin's Black Box by Dr. Michael Behe. Powerful, powerful book on intelligent design. Signature in the Cell. It's 800 pages long, and it's very scientific. Maybe a little above your head, but it's definitely something you might want to look into. You might have to read it 4 times because it's really in-depth, particularly in biochemistry. Darwin's Dilemma is a lot of the fossil record that I talked about tonight, also by Dr. Stephen Meyer. And finally, Bones of Contention by Marvin Lubenow. These are extra study that you could go into to see that what I'm saying in 1 hour and 10 minutes is, there's more to it than that. It's not just my opinion. This is real science. And finally, you can finally agree that God is God and choose to recognize his right to rule your life. C.S. Lewis was an atheist until he was about 29, 30, somewhere in there. He finally had to come to grips with the fact that when he looked at it scientifically, philosophically, and logically, he had no choice. He said it would be intellectual dishonesty not to say that God is God. And he said, so I became the most reluctant convert in all of England. He said, because I had no choice but to get down on my knees and say, you are God. And when he made that choice, he said, I was surprised by joy. I was surprised by joy. I didn't know what I was missing being an atheist for so many years. But he said, I had no choice. I had to be intellectually honest. Well, let's pray about this.